So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you very much to Alfie and Isaac for coming in to have a chat about us with the project. So to introduce the panel, maybe what I might start with is maybe we'll discuss the premise of the project in using this combination of a very popular esport game with site-specific recreation, and also with a recreation of something that has a thematic parallel to the game itself. So I might start with Alfie. When we introduced this to you, where did your brain go with this?
Right, okay, well, look, thanks for letting me know about it and having me along. And I guess I just say, I mean, I know kind of less than nothing about the technical side of these things. And I just say maybe where I'm coming from and my first impressions. I guess I'm like kind of a sort of video games theorist, but it's more like I have my background in philosophy, so I really have no background in like the technical side of it. It's much more the theoretical side of it. And so what I work on is like, I'm particularly working at the moment about the ways in which reality is becoming like a video game, rather than the ways in which video games are becoming increasingly like reality. I'm looking at the kind of theoretical ways in which we can conceive of reality as becoming increasingly video game-like in its experience. And I'm doing like a range of research into different cases which could be thought of like that. Some very silly examples, like how you can find the same API and programming interfaces in things like Pokemon Go and in things like Grindr or dating apps. So that I'm noticing patterns in the structure of the way we like relate to Pokemon and the way we relate to people and things like that. And other more serious examples, for example, like things like drone strikes and how the experience of deploying a drone is increasingly like the experience of playing a video game which deploys a drone. In this kind of world where we can conceive of video games as a very important thing, which is actually changing reality rather than just kind of representing and reflecting it. I think that one of the most important topics there is the relationship between kind of real and digital space. And I'm working on a number of kind of theorists, as we've been talking about, a number of theorists such as Guy Debord and Henri Lefebvre, who talk about the architectural space, and I'm kind of trying to apply those to digital space. And this project is one that comes very close to those interests of mine, and it is exploring what are the connections and what the changing relationships between real space and digital space. I think that I'm in this why I find this game very exciting, or this project very exciting, and I'm really like the fact that people, as we were talking before, Peter, people recommended that you use Unity or maybe render it as a standalone thing so that you would create the space and it would not be in the Counter-Strike environment. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the fact that you kind of stuck to your guns, no pun intended, and put the gun in there and made it a Counter-Strike environment, because it's exactly the kind of thing I'm fascinated by. Like the fact that we play games like Counter-Strike actually do change the way we conceive of space itself, and you're kind of confronting us with that problem. And I think that by putting the real space of Hong Kong into the Counter-Strike environment, you're actually producing quite an uncanny feeling in certain ways, and making people realise that the way we actually experience the space around us is now mediated in quite changing and different ways by technology itself. So I think that from a theoretical perspective, like the realisation that you kind of force on your users of the program is really quite theoretically useful. It's kind of forcing people to confront some of the truths about the relationship between space and technology today. So it's great to see an example of that done in such an interesting way, and to see, and also my kind of last introductory comment would be that it's fascinating that it should be in Hong Kong, that is the space should be a Hong Kong space, because Hong Kong does seem to me to be kind of one of these kind of sort of contemporary dystopias in which space is increasingly changed. But it's got this kind of striking architectural history, but it's also one of the spaces in which, like, things like digital media is playing a key role in the kind of reorganisation of space. So it's fascinating that it should emerge out of Hong Kong's history. So, I mean, I guess those are the issues I think the game raises, all kinds of abstract and theoretical concerns about the relationship between real and digital space, and really forces us to kind of have some discussions about them. So I guess that's my impression and where I'm coming from.
And Isaac, you come from quite a different area of work. When Andrew sort of tapped you on the shoulder, because for us we don't know what people will think, and we assumed that people might have quite different reactions to this. So as you learned about the project, what was your thought process? Like a similar question.
Right. Well, first I have to confess that I'm an idiot in game playing. Like, the only game that I play is SimCity, which I actually still play that. I have a fetish on SimCity. I'm more like, learning from you guys more than offering something. But one thing that actually really fascinates me is like the idea of bunker, which actually Andrew also wrote it in the curatorial artist statement, which about like the technologies of bunker, which Paul Virilio philosophers was like really examining the history of bunker. Which I thought that was quite interesting to put that into also the context of your work. In the way that like what Paul Virilio was talking about was like, the invention of bunker, the design of that is in itself a technology. The whole premise was like, accidents was actually being invented in, modern time. For example, without the invention of airplane, there won't be plane crash. So also like, the architecture of bunker in itself is a representation of the inception of modernity, that how like war is being invented and how social system is being invented, and that is vividly being represented in architecture and architectural design. Which I thought that was very interesting that your work is like, highlight transforming that kind of time, that kind of architecture in an online gaming space, which also echoes to a lot of like gaps for now, which, for example, if you want a job in Cathay Pacific as a pilot, then you have to be a good game player.
Really?
Yeah, they're going to test you whether how good you play the game. Like the modern time, the contemporary time, like war is really operated very differently, which actually a lot of this architecture has showed the failure of, as a tactics of war. Which now, like war is like kind of like, being operated in a way that kind of like is setting you, in a room and, controlling a lot of different things, kind of feel like a gameplay. So what fascinates me is to understand kind of transforming that space, like that technologies by that time, and put it into the current technologies of war. And what is the kind of the gap? What is the meaning of putting that kind of context into the current kind of setting? Which I thought like like what Baudrillard before he died, he was like really kind of far-fetched of thinking about war by this time. It's like because it's just like also what you talked about, that kind of technology is becoming the reality, that like war is operated very microly right now, and it's like no longer that kind of big, huge architectural objects, but like, for example, terrorist attack is something that is like very micro, and that's like kind of like the matrix of current time. So I'm not like, trying to answer these questions, like, but I thought that was quite fascinating of how you guys put this kind of the technologies from the past, right? Itself, like architecture as a technology, to the architecture of game design, and what is the gap between these two things? What does it imply, or how does the audience kind of, by experiencing the architecture from the old time, and what kind of thing that they gain from this project? The other aspect was like I was very fascinated about was like I didn't know about this site, so I actually watched the YouTube videos of the research done by Lawrence Lai, And like, you know, I think it's very interesting to see the architecture in the way of like as a historical preservation. But I also think that, like, you know, how stories is being portrayed from the past to bring it forward. For example, like if you think about architecture, is like intrinsically very the design of architecture is intrinsically very insightful in representing, you know, certain period of time. For example, if you think about the public housing estate in Hong Kong, like all these kind of square setting, like really kind of implying by the time the British government was really because they're very poor. So they don't have security guards, so they created this architecture so that everybody could survey each other in the way of like if there's one room there's a fire and the whole building would know. So like a lot of architectures in Hong Kong actually imply social fabrics and social public administration and a lot of politics of that. So what kind of politics does that kind of research, a mapping of this architecture of bunker, tell us a story of the past, and what does it mean to the present? Particularly in the YouTube video, one thing that really struck me was like a tribute to all the people who died, and the whole idea of Japanese invasion after, like, you know, all the years. Like, what does it mean to us? What does historical preservation means to us? If this project is being played as a part of historical preservation, what kind of role or what kind of story would that represent to us? Would that be something as portrayed as the British army was like so lazy, the British government never cared about Hong Kong, and they just give up? Because I was very interested in the story of like Lawrence in the YouTube video was portraying. Like, you know, because how does that kind of fit into the national narrative right now? And this kind of notions, and what is the artist's intention of putting that particular site to the present time in the current moment, and how does that kind of could be deployed to tell a story of the past in order to let us rethink about our current time. So these kind of issues are more just like, you know, very scattered, you know, trying to pick up a lot of these kind of things, and then to think about maybe some possible ways of, like, you know, think about. And also one more thing is that I was very fascinated by, very interested how would the game players would perceive the game, you know, as in contrast to other games. There are so many war games, right? And how does this particular game that really represents the particular site, location, and history, how does that intrinsically different from other gameplay? And is it the intention of the artist to create a failure of like gameplay, or is it like how does it, what kind of the user's experience in this project? So these are just a very scattered, you know, ideas that I was like kind of quite interested in exploring or here.
To answer one of your questions about, one of your ideas about the context, the social and administrative context of the time, the bunker system was proposed before World War I, and then after World War I, they started building this complex around the same time as the European nations started building fortifications around their borders as buffer zones, in a way that, like, because World War I was strictly trench warfare, and then the pushing forward between trenches and taking the enemy trenches, and every day you might get like 10 feet or be pushed back 10 feet. The idea then was to sort of have sufficient buffer to absorb the enemy, and then they'll slowly run out of supplies or slowly run out of gas or extend their logistics too far, and at that point then you can push back. And this bunker system was built as part of that ideology, but it was finished in 1938, and by that time Hitler and the Japanese also figured out that the idea of like speed attacks, like quick, efficient, fast, small groups, was going to overcome the idea of these like lines and like this structural sort of the beast version of the warfare. And Virilio goes over that detail. Yeah, so by the time World War II came around, it was already like this technology was already a failure, in a sense that the Meiji Outline was also a failure, that the Germans were able to fly over it, and in this case the Japanese were able to take it like extremely quickly. I guess in that way it's kind of interesting that there's sort of like the failure of the site. This failure of the technology in the changing times, and then yet the sort of transition from that to gaming, which is just like speed, like the speed of connection and all that.
There are, to me, some of the things that I will remember the most about this process is the stuff that we fought over as a team, because we had myself, Andrew, and Alexis, who couldn't be here today because he's in Shanghai. And the stuff we fought over, to me, it's close to the truth of the project in some of these questions that, like, when Andrew and I first started discussing this, Andrew was talking about how people use the site today, which is really interesting. Like, they have signs there saying no playing war games are stuck on the walls there, because kids go in, or adults go in with airsoft guns and like BB guns, and pretty much play Counter-Strike. Like, in terms of the rule, how they play, and the strangeness that. So Andrew was doing all of the historical research and feeding that to us constantly, and as we were playing this and hearing this research, every time you test the map and you shoot another computer bot, you're like, this is too much. You're reading about people dying, and you're doing it. And you're like, this is strange. You're sitting on this line, and but the other truth of the site is that the failure saved lives, as we were discussing earlier. That because of this structure where everyone got lost, amazingly only 2 people died because it didn't do what it was supposed to do. But in a way, the success of the site, bizarrely, is the people with the airsoft guns. That, to me, that's a strange other level that the site operates on. And I don't see it as coincidental that it's so close to this game, because we get to this, like, the abstraction of warfare in a game is that everybody agrees on the rules, and part of the reason we're getting kicked off the server is because the server is enforcing rules. It's saying, you have to play in this way, and we think you're hacking because either the way you're using textures or whatever you're doing, boom, that's why all our computers aren't working now. And I was thinking about this morning, that I heard on the radio the other day that the US government were doing these war games in the early 2000s about a potential invasion of Iran. And they had all these, they brought up all their battleships, and then they had one US general pretending to not so explicitly be Iran. And the US general was looking at all these ships that could just send rockets over, and he just got creative and sent over a bunch of tiny boats packed with explosives and destroyed all of the warships. And the response from the US military was, oh, that's not fair. No, we'll change the rules and we'll start again. And you think, well, that's, when you're talking about war and games overlapping, when last week we had a lot of players realise that we hadn't turned off cheats and they completely changed the game, I thought, well, okay, like, it's only a game if everybody agrees on the rules, but if you don't want to, that's okay, you can play differently. But of course, war is not like that. Of course not, it's ridiculous. And these contrasts, I think, that if the truth is a BB gun game, and the reality is that, thank God, the site didn't work, because so many young men would have died pointlessly. But yeah, these are the arguments we had in, well, what sort of game are we making? Like, it became really confusing, because what is the level of realism to operate on?
One thing you say there, like, massively really fascinates me, and it relates to the question I'm always getting from people who say I do video game studies and things. So, also, I generally work on, like, the politics of games. So what is the kind of ideology, which the gamer is being encouraged to believe in? Put the most simple way, when they're playing the game. And people are always asking me questions like, well, so is it wrong to play, say, Call of Duty? Because, I mean, the arguments range from, really stupid arguments that have been going around for years and years, like, it'll desensitize the gamer to war and things like that, right through to quite complex theoretical arguments that, in some ways, such games can kind of interpolate you and in the end gradually encourage you to take a particular ideological position towards the things, even though you may know that, oh, it's just a game. And I think it's fascinating what you say, because when you describe, like, oh, the more historical research you did, the more guilty you feel shooting someone who had done it. That seems to me fascinating. It's like actually the opposite of what usually happens with war games, where the more the more of the shooting you do down the tunnels, the less interested you become in the individual life, the fake person that you're shooting. So I think it's a good example of something that really, I mean, just if you just want a bit of praise, I think it's a real great example of like playing a game against the grain, like what Walter Benjamin describes as playing something or doing something against the grain of the logic which it wants you to experience it as. Because, you know, Counter-Strike is an example of a war game which on the whole is a relatively right-wing American ideology game. And or certainly to many, I mean, I'm interested to know if you don't think so, but you know, your experience of looking at a particular small area which is related to real history, and will actually force you to play the game against the grain and confront some of the structure of Counter-Strike itself. So I wonder if, yeah, I mean, I was thinking of asking that question. I mean, you situated it more in like, you know, why did you guys choose Counter-Strike, for example? I'd like to know what you think of that. And is this a kind of a critique of Counter-Strike, or a subversion of Counter-Strike, or you see it as an extension of? What's the?
To a certain extent, I see it as a subversion of Counter-Strike, but at the same time, we're utilizing it in a way. We're utilizing the method of its gameplay, I think, and like utilizing in the sense that. How the movement of the player and the use of like the pistol, and using a site intended for war in a war game, but then we're also confronted with all the issues between the two that Counter-Strike doesn't necessarily accurately depict war. In that way, it doesn't quite work with the site, and that's rather interesting. That's one of the things we thought about a lot, actually.
Yeah, like the way that I think we started initially because it, like all art projects, it started in a bar when we were, you know, a few in, and it kind of, well, like Andrew suggested, and we're like, yeah, that kind of makes sense, and then we just started working.
Was Counter-Strike part of the initial?
Yes.
Yes.
Early on.
So it wasn't like we need a medium to do something we already conceived. It was more like you had the plan to...
Yeah, that was Andrew.
That is
wanted to do that for a while.
Part of the reason why we didn't use the Unity thing, go that route, it was like we went down this more complicated, much more humbling route. That part of the reason was we wanted to sort of court that the Counter-Strike community that is however millions of people. You know, there's millions of individual profiles, and there's like 80,000 people playing per day. And there's also like pro leagues and all this, like there's this whole infrastructure behind that. We sort of wanted to press the two up against each other.
And from my side, like being, so Alexi and myself were sort of stuck in Hammer, which is the editing tool, for a long time. And Alexi was definitely the true brains behind how we managed to build the tunnels, because he worked out a lot of particular truths about how you have to build in Hammer for it to be functional. And those truths to me defined the very particular abstraction that Counter-Strike functions on. And I don't know if it translates to the broader politics of the game, but certainly at a philosophical level, when you get down to how Counter-Strike has to be built, it is so far from any architectural reality in just what it has to do in order for these maps to function quickly, that really just based on that, in the same way that when we talk about drawing perspective systems, which is my kind of background, we talk about the straitjacket of perspectives, that it has to warp reality to fit into that abstraction of space. And the abstractions of Counter-Strike we found very sort of, we found that straitjacket basically in the way that we had to build on grid. And even the developers at Valve still talk about how much of a pain it is to build in Counter-Strike. So, and I know that it's slightly an academic point, but those abstractions make me think a lot about, reflecting back on the site, this tension between people using it to shoot BB guns and what actually happened there, and how vastly different they are. I don't have an answer on that, but I see that tension in how we had to build this whole thing. And that's also why when we first started, we became quite adamant on this 1v1 experience, that the moment the game became the game, it also finished. But because Andrew said, we have to be very open to the fact that we're working with a very established community and a very established medium, and so to put it in as a team play game, it's another truth of the medium that we still had to just see what it is. But in Ultimate Answers, it's a question we never really answered for ourselves. But as I spoke to you earlier, my principal reason for using this medium was that when I see other historical recreations, they are built on computer games with the gun removed.
Yeah.
So, essentially like engines like Unity or Unreal or whatever it is, it's first-person shooter game technology. So one of the, to me, obvious reasons to use Counter-Strike is it's the truth of the technology.
And, I mean, that is something I absolutely love about what you guys have done, actually. And I think it has a really bigger, wider theoretical relevance as well. I mean, okay, it's fascinating just what you say, that a lot of historical, when you projects, presumably these are university-funded projects which recreate historical events or sites using first-person shooter technology, and that's fascinating to me to just know that. And the fact that they remove the gun, as you say, it hides a part of the truth of the technology which is actually being used there. And I think that relates to sort of something I'm interested in working on in a much wider theoretical sense, which is that the way in which we render our experience of everyday life is mediated through these kinds of technology, and the general public often has that deliberately obscured by various people with different interests in obscuring the reality of the technology which is behind which is mediating our experiences of everyday life. So it's just one more example of that, but and to put it back in, to make visible the truth of the technology that's being used in those ways, I think it's a very important thing to do. It seems to be a very...
Well, we got stuck with a few examples. Like, I'd be interested to see how you guys... Like, our crisis point was, the kid who got kicked out of school for making the Counter-Strike level at his school. And this was like
it's happened twice.
Yeah, it's happened a bunch of times.
Well, it's happened more times.
And once just after the Columbine massacre. Yeah. And those kids famously were making their own Doom mods as well. I think it was Doom? Doom?
I don't remember.
They were designing computer game levels as well, sort of based on their violent fantasies. Yeah. And so for us, we have to think about this, we think about it all the time, and that's why I was saying we never really answered these questions cohesively, but the motivations to me were that it's all there, and it is this tension between an abstraction but also a representation that is very clearly related to predatory vision, which is sort of it gets to a point when everybody says no. Even on the Counter-Strike servers, some people look at some maps and say, no, that's in bad taste.
It's in bad taste,
yeah. And I took a little inspiration from this friend of mine, an artist called Josh Hale, he did a recreation of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney in, I think in Unreal Engine, and somewhere in the code there was a rocket launcher still in there, because often you import these prefabricated blocks of code to put together first-person walkthroughs. And I can't remember how it happened, but Josh had this artwork installed once, and someone found out how to get a rocket launcher in it. And it was just a recreation of the museum. It was really funny.
That's very good. Yeah.
And it always made me think, well, it's always there somewhere, whether it's still technically in the artifact or just implied by the point of view.
It's there in the structure.
When they asked for the walkthrough, I thought, well, ain't this interesting, that you might not like the game, but you want the vision the game produces, and that.
And just as a first impression, someone who's played for half an hour, I thought it's quite interesting how it isn't really linear, and you catch fragments of different stories through the audio and through the visual, which cannot really be put together. Well, you'd be experiencing it very differently if it was put through into a linear walkthrough story. It's nice how it's kind of a space that you explore and catch different fragments as you go along. So it's interesting that they immediately asked for that. It's kind of, you've achieved something quite different to that.
Yeah.
Are there any questions that, from the audience or from you guys that you guys would like to ask us in either process or motivation?
Could you guys talk a little bit about the audio, like some of the, because I think when you guys talked about just how for you, as you do more research, you get confronted more and more by the reality and the history of it. I think for my first encounter, I don't necessarily like get that like, oh, I shot someone because I'm playing the game, but the parts that start to bring that to light is the audio. Like when I do hear some Cantonese, I think I start to get confronted more with the reality and the history of it. I guess two questions. One is, just could you explain just some of the audio, like what are those audio tracks? And also just what are some other ways you guys think you can bring forth the research and the history into the game to make it kind of more subversive experience?
For the audio, we pulled from a bunch of different sources. So you heard the Cantonese, which was from eyewitness accounts of the war and then the ensuing occupation. I think those were placed in the bunkers. So places that you would settle that like you wouldn't have as much action in. So there's this little area that you can just hang out in, and then the trigger will set off the audio. There's also bat noises.
Bat noises are not outside because we lost it outside.
All right.
So it's mainly the music.
Okay. We also have like Japanese propaganda from that time period, specifically kamikaze, sort of their anthems, and that's placed in the point where the counter-terrorists of the Japanese side would start, and then as they walk through, they sort of have their own experience of that ensuing into the maze, the sort of maze part of it, which has more culturally diverse influences. We have Shinzuko Kasigi, which was a Japanese jazz boogie woogie musician. So that was in Japan before World War II. It was the beginning of like when jazz came to Japan, and that was seen by the nationalists at that time as being like Western and like terrible and bad. And they promoted more traditional music and military music. And during World War II, she had like no records came out. There's like a block that's kind of missing. And then right afterwards, during the American occupation of Japan, then she started getting famous. And there's like Tokyo Boogie Woogie and Shopping Boogie Woogie, which sort of immediately reflects the American sort of capitalism and the market society. In one of the songs, it's basically a 2-minute list.
Shopping list.
Sort of, it's a shopping list basically of all the things she has to buy in the market that day, and how she just can't be bothered, or like how it's like so much bother to go about it. We also have Tori Di Kino, which was also known as Tokyo Rose. She was a Japanese American, who went back to Tokyo to visit her dying mother right before the war started, and when the war started and she couldn't get back. So she was kind of like lost in Japan. They wouldn't send her back, and she was coerced into doing these radio broadcasts that were broadcasted to American troops later in the war. And it was sort of this like very subversive, sort of like, our men don't want to fight you. What are you doing here? Why don't you go home to your families? Like this, you're fighting on the wrong side, yada yada. And because she had a very American accent, that sort of was throwing them off a little bit, or that was the idea. And then when she returned back to America after the war, she was court-martialed for 5 years for being for treason. So it's sort of like her life within the landscape of the war, like between the two sides. The third one is
and later released.
Yeah,
she was released. So like, it wasn't your choice.
Yeah. And then also,
there's all the British songs too.
Yeah, there's all the British songs. There's also a Japanese lady by the name of Yoshio Yamaguchi, which was in Cantonese known as Leung, who was she grew up in Manchukuo, so Japanese Mongolia, and was put in films. She was brought up as Chinese even though she was Japanese, and then she was put in Chinese films that were done by Japanese studios. and she was in China during the war, and after the war, they threatened to execute her unless she basically got her papers together and proved that she was a Japanese national and returned to Japan. And later on, like in the 60s, she goes to America and is in like Hollywood movies and entertaining Japanese Americans there under the name of Shirley Yamaguchi. So she's got 3 names. Like it's this weird sort of like in-betweenness that happens.
Yeah, and then there's a bunch of British radio broadcasts, and every sound that Andrew dug up, they were all slightly conflicted. Like the conflict that we identified in the whole map making process, all the sounds they're all a little bit uncomfortable like that. And then Alexis was adamant on having that little speech from George Orwell that's cut up a few times. And what happens with the sounds in the tunnels, the way that we try to do it is that knowing that the players are always moving quickly, the sound is always attenuated, so it gets louder and softer. It's got a little epicenter. So we tried to have those epicenters spaced from the little invisible trigger that sets off the sound, so that when you hit a sound, it's at some, there's a bit where George Orwell says, power, and you run away. So that there was a degree to which it was an interesting challenge in sound design to know that it's a game where you're just running. So what sort of sounds either are worthwhile when you just hear a fragment of them, or might want you, if you're sort of breaking the game a bit, might want to make you stop and listen to the rest of it. You have to make that choice. And that was part of the limitation of the structure too, that it was very difficult to get sounds that don't attenuate like that. So they're always limited somewhat by their location and the sort of tunnel structure itself.
I guess I'd like to. Oh, there's more questions.
I was going to continue on this.
Yeah.
The one that struck me was the slightly Russian sounding one that goes, I think that.
Oh,
Sorry.
I remember that.
I think that. That's Tokyo Rose. She says.
So it's a Russian one.
I don't think I was guilty, but I'm not. Yeah. So there was an interview that Andrew found with Tokyo Rose long after she got out of jail, and she's reflecting back on the process of being conscripted to be a propagandist and then returning to her home country. So she could have stayed in Japan, she never would have gone to jail, but she was a US citizen who wanted to go home, and for political reasons, I think it was the Eisenhower sort of, or the FBI or whoever sent her to jail.
Made an example of her.
Yeah, made an example of her, and then later on, she was exonerated. And she's talking about, she says something like, that's the Oriental Stoicism, that if you wait long enough, people will realise that they told a lie and that I didn't do anything wrong. And so she's bizarrely stoic about it. And so that's that one that she's just saying, look, I don't think I did anything wrong, but I just had to wait 10 years until people agree with me. But yeah, we tried to put them at places that there's a very subtle narrative in terms of whether you start at the Japanese end or at the British end, and then in what order you hear the sounds. But knowing that as people play, that all gets mixed around, because the map is so large and so confusing that that order will always get reshuffled in some way. But yeah.
Do you guys have plans to make it like a fully usable map for the community, like for CSGO players actually?
Yeah, basically we definitely had constraints of time. That already this project took a lot longer than expected, and Alexis, he spent the last sort of 3 weeks before our launch making the outside landscape. And the idea with that is that the whole thing should be pathed, so that, because in reality what happened is, the Japanese ran over the surface and just, threw grenades down the holes, and the whole structure didn't work. So the landscape is made that it does work like that. But because Hammer and Counter-Strike Source Engine and Hammer map editor is very fussy, to block off elements of the mountains where you just fall off and get stuck or something like that. We got about 8 hours into that, and we kept finding so many tiny holes that we realized it would really be about a 2-week job to path it properly. Like, I spent one night pathing it, and I thought it would all work fine. But because I'm used to more contemporary 3D programs, so there's a difference. Like a 3D program now, if you have a gap between a wall that big, and your character is this big, the character won't go through the wall because the gap's too small. But in Hammer you do. You really have to have every vertex of a barrier overlapping, because it's this thing, there's the word leak that comes up in Counter-Strike forums a lot, and if you have these leaks, you can just get sucked straight out and end up, stuck behind a rock. And because of that problem, that to us it broke the game so much, and it broke the experience so badly, that we made a last-minute decision and we just boxed off all of the outdoor areas. But underneath that, the whole landscape is pathable. So if we had the opportunity, like right now we have other projects, but if we had the opportunity, we'd spend a good few weeks and open that back up again.
I was also going to ask just about that kind of future, what you're going to do with it. But I guess I was also thinking, would it be a map? But also, are you any plans to use it, make it available, I don't know, for want of a better word, educationally? Is there any, or will there be any places where it's playable, or just so that people can use it for a little bit of historical interest and learn a little bit about all the research you've done into it? Is it available in that way? Will it be available in that way?
Yeah, it's on Steam.
So anyone can...
Anybody can download it as long as you have a Counter-Strike account. That is one of the
I bet some
limitations.
Hong Kong museums would be interested in featuring it.
But would they?
Yeah, that's the
Would
thing.
they?
Would they?
It's a bit weird.
Too weird.
But I think there's a lot of
That's what we
potential.
Yeah, there is,
Going in
yeah.
different directions that this project could take.
I think in an art context it might work a little bit better.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that it is a game and it is a sort of historical object, and it is also a piece of art all at the same time, and it kind of works weirdly on all those levels.
But part of Andrew's logic from the get-go was to have it on Steam. So you can go home and play it. If you've got a Counter-Strike account, and we were thinking of also if there's any way to make some of our test accounts publicly available, but it really only works on a private messaging thing, because if you log in, then you need a confirmation code to get sent to our email, blah blah blah. But it's up there. And we'll try to push it as much so that it's as easy to find as possible on Steam, because there's thousands and thousands of maps, and we've found it is a little bit difficult to find. But the intention was that. Also, Andrew's put together a blog that has really quite a lot of our process there for people to read, and we've written a short article that will be coming out about it. But the artifact itself, if you're on Counter-Strike, it's there.
Is it, because you were talking about limitations, kind of from the historical reconstruction point of view, is it always in the intention that you say you only compromise, say, the map, when there's a technical limitations, or is there kind of aesthetic or artistic decisions that you may tweak a little bit?
Not really. To us it was if you pursue realism, you learn what abstraction is, or something like that. We made as few changes as possible, and we went as far as we could in terms of getting the architecture as close as possible, and that's how we learned the abstraction of Hammer and of Counter-Strike. I don't think we didn't add anything in that shouldn't have been there.
It's the limitation of the medium.
We moved the toilet. We moved the toilet. And that was an artistic decision, because we just thought it was really weird. It didn't have a door on it. And Alexis was playing last night, and he calls me up and he's like, Peter, we need to move the toilet. It's just weird. You walk past and there's just an open door with the toilet taking up the whole space. I think that's not nice to these guys. They need some privacy.
I wonder if soldiers are just okay with that though.
But also,
they train together. Right?
But we made that toilet based on an assumption of that was the type of toilet they had, because that's what was being used at the time, and that's the part of the building that the toilet was in. But because that doesn't exist anymore, maybe it was a little bit more discreet. But in the map, we put it downstairs and around the corner because it just seemed a little...
In the kitchen.
Yeah, well, next to the kitchen.
It's a
But
bit
yeah.
better.
Food in, food out.
Because there were a lot of gaps that we had to sort of guess, like, yeah. Because if you look at it now, it's a concrete ruin. So we interpret it as close as we could to any photographic things, but moving the toilet's the only one I can think of that we all...
The blue lights.
Oh yeah. Well, and the sound, obviously. But the lights were a funny one because obviously there were no lights in the tunnels.
Right.
For every possible reason. People would have flashlights. You can't put a flashlight in Counter-Strike anymore for very specific reasons. And, because the only thing that Counter-Strike lets you pick up is a weapon. So that took me a few days to work that out. And then you can't have darkness in a computer game because it's not darkness, it's a black screen. So there are certain abstractions that they might make sense when you're making something, but if you make a dark map, you're in a room, sitting in a chair, looking at a black screen. So you have to make abstractions that make sense.
Just like cinematic darkness.
Yeah. And like even the way the lights are, there are lights where there are no vents, and then there's a light inside the vent, which means that when you walk up to an air vent, it's dark and you see light coming from the vent, even though there's actually a light behind you where there should be no light. But it was the only way for it to make sense so that you can see where you're going, but also that there is shadow near a vent and light coming from it. That was one of Alexis' sort of innovations, but none of that is logical. It's a complete abstraction, but it's the abstraction that makes the thing make sense.
Right.